Hey CW Bio, Mr. Kennedy here, and this is part 2 of your video series on chapters 15 and 16, Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection, and how populations evolve. So in our last video, we spent a lot of time talking about who Charles Darwin was and kind of how natural selection, plays out and changes populations over time. So here we're going to pick up that story by looking at fossils because, they're evidence of what populations of the past looked like so that we could compare them to populations of the present and figure out how they might have changed over time. So a fossil, basically is an important source of evolutionary evidence because they have in them records of early life and evolutionary history. Now, if you remember what I taught you about fossils in a previous video, you got to remember that, 95% of the species that scientists believe once walked the earth, so to speak, are no longer with us. And of that 95% that are no longer with us, only a small fraction fossilized. And of that small fraction that fossilized, an even smaller fraction has actually been discovered. So the fossil record is incomplete at best. So the record can help us understand that evolution occurred, change over time happened, but exactly who or what evolved into who or what can't really be said by just looking at the fossils. Paleontologists do not have fossils for all the changes that have occurred from one population to the next to make a complete lineage of a single organism. That being said, they still try to use what evidence they have to kind of gain a better understanding of the overall picture of how most groups evolved. Okay? Fossils are found throughout the world, and as the fossil record becomes more complete, who knows? Maybe our picture of change over time will become more complete too. As it sits right now, the only thing that we kind of, have a lineage on from the fossil record is actually a horse. This is an example using a camel so that you can kind of get an idea for how paleontologists try to piece things together. Right? So going back 65 million years ago, you got this little thing that looks like a dog, and paleontologists try to connect the dots to present day camel with the understanding that, hey, where could camels possibly come from? In the real world, things tend to go from simple to complex. So maybe there was a simpler or smaller organism, camel-like in nature in the past, that evolved into the camel thing that we see today, right? That's kind of the mindset of how fossils are interpreted from past to present. We look for something similar or similar appearing, and we try to follow that through era after era until we get to something in today's world that resembles the thing from the past. Okay, so that's how fossils in theory, show change in population over time. Another thing for us to consider when we're looking at change over time in population is anatomy. So anatomy, this involves looking at what we call homologous and analogous structures in, organisms. Homologous structures are structures with a common evolutionary origin, but they might have a totally different function in the individual that currently possesses it. So in this picture, we've got a whale forelimb, crocodile forelimb, and a bird wing. So the whale, crocodile forelimb, and bird forelimb or wing all have the same basic hand-like structure that you and I have. There's fingers, there's the back of the hand, there's kind of a forearm, all that kind of stuff like that. So that's common evolutionary origin. Paleontologists, evolutionists will look at this and go, these guys must all be related somehow because they all have the same bone structure, and maybe at some point in history, they were all part of the same population. Can we prove it? No, but it's how this kind of thing is put together, okay? The body parts of organisms that do not have common evolutionary origin but are similar in function are called analogous structures. So in this case, we're not looking for same bone structure, we're looking for same function. So in this case, we might be comparing the wing of a bird to the wing of an insect. that would be an analogous structure because both of them give the owner the ability to fly. So maybe these guys are somehow distantly related because they both fly. Can we prove that? No, but it's like how this thing is done. Okay. All right. Vestigial structures, another case in point of populations changing over time. A vestigial structure is a body structure in a present day organism that realistically serves no purpose, or maybe just doesn't serve its original purpose. So, as a case in point, let's look at this whale. Whales have like pelvic bones back by their tail, and well, whales swim in the ocean, so why do they have pelvic bones? Bones that might be needed to support like back legs or something if they don't have any back legs. So evolutionists and paleontologists will use this as a arguing point for the idea that maybe whales at some point had like 4 legs and walked on land and lost those legs after they decided to go swimming for a while. Okay, so that's a vestigial structure. There are eyes that fish who live in caves have. Like, why do you still have eyes if you live in the dark? Well, it's a vestigial structure. You don't need them anymore, but they're still there. Embryology is another case in point, which potentially leads us to the idea that populations change over time. So we have the embryo here of a fish, a reptile, and a bird, and a mammal. And if you look close, each one shows what are called pharyngeal gill pouches and a tail. So evolutionists and paleontologists would argue that because all of these guys have pharyngeal pouches and a tail, that they must all be somehow related to each other. Okay, can we prove it? No, but that's how it's done, because where else did a mammal get like its gill pouches and a tail if it didn't get it from something like a bird, a reptile, or a fish? Like, that's the mindset. Okay, so we can't prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt by any stretch of the imagination, but that's how these connections are made. If they look similar, then they must be related in some way, shape, or form. Okay, according to evolutionary thought. So it's the shared features in the young embryos that suggest evolution from a distant common ancestor. All right. Last thing to look at that might allude to like population change over time is biochemistry. Biochemistry can provide potentially strong evidence for evolution because nearly all organisms share DNA, ATP, and many other enzymes along with their other biochemical molecules. One enzyme in particular, cytochrome C, occurs in organisms as diverse as bacteria and bison. So the thought is, well, if bacteria have cytochrome C and bison have cytochrome C, like where'd the bison get the cytochrome C? It must at some point, somehow, some way be related, like to bacteria or vice versa, right? The bacteria is bison, like, I don't know. Okay, so the more similarities that we see in stuff like cytochrome C and their DNA and all that kind of stuff like that, the closer the relationship is thought to be. So this data shows the number of amino acid substitutions in the amino acid sequences of different organisms. So the fewer the substitutions, the more similar they are, and vice versa. And again, the more similar they are, the closer the perceived relationship. Okay. Organisms that are biochemically similar have fewer differences in their amino acid sequences and are thought to be related. There you go. Since Darwin's time, scientists have constructed evolutionary diagrams that show all kinds of relationships among species. In the 1970s, some biologists began using RNA and DNA nucleotide sequences to construct evolutionary diagrams as well. And today, scientists combine data from fossils, anatomy, embryology, biochemistry, all these different sources to try to confer like relationships from one population to the next. So let's explore some of this population genetics and evolution, right? The principles of today's modern theories of evolution are rooted in population genetics and other related fields of study that are expressed in genetic terms. So let's dig into this and see what's going on. Now, we've got a whole unit number of videos on genetics. So if you don't recall things like genotypes and phenotypes and all that kind of stuff like that, go watch those videos because it's going to be important to your success here. Genes, they determine most of an individual's features, such as your tooth shape, your flower color. And if organisms' genes are the same, then, from one species to the next or one population to the next, again, relationships are thought to exist. If an organism has a feature called a phenotype in genetic terms that is poorly adapted to the environment, well, that organism may be unable to survive and reproduce. Remember what I said about advantageous adaptations? If you don't got them, then you're not going to be successful. Within its lifetime, an individual organism cannot evolve a new phenotype by natural selection. It cannot. So no matter how hard Mr. Kennedy tries, even if I get up every night and I wish upon that first star, wish I might, wish on this star that I see tonight, I can't evolve. I can't. I'm just stuck with what I got. I can't change my genotype. I can't change my phenotype. An individual cannot evolve regardless of the natural selection pressure that's being put on me. Okay? Natural selection acts on a range of phenotypes in a population. Okay? And the way it acts on those phenotypes is by eliminating individuals that don't have advantageous adaptations in that population. So each member has genes that characterize the traits of that species, and those genes exist as pairs of alleles. Evolution occurs as a population's genes and their frequencies change over time. What's changing their frequencies? Whether or not I survive to reproduce. That's what's changing your frequency. So all the genes that are inside of a specific individual will either be passed on to the next generation and their frequency or incidence of occurrence will go up, or that individual will get eaten and then all the genes that were in that individual, well, their frequency will go down, right? And that's how that population will evolve over time, okay? So how can a population's genes evolve over time? Well, we got to look at the gene pool and the allele frequency within it, right? That's a collective picture of all of the population's genes. So when we look at the entire population of people on this planet, like all the genes of all the people on the planet, that's the human gene pool, okay? Yeah, so that's a lot of genetics if we're talking about, millions and millions of humans. So we usually don't talk about it in that kind of terms. We'll take a smaller sample. Anyways, that's the gene pool. The percentage of any specific allele in the gene pool is called its allele frequency. And I suppose just for like layman's terms, a way you can look at that is go, okay, like if we look at all the people on Earth, if, and I don't know if this is true, so don't quote me on this, but if, like, I don't know, 50% of people on Earth had black hair, then the allele frequency for the genes that have black hair or cause black hair is 50%, because 50% of the population has them. So that's the percentage of any specific allele in the gene pool. And as that percentage changes, that's where we get evolution. So if more and more people have black hair, then that allele frequency will go up, and the end result in our population is more and more people with black hair. Like, that's how it works. It's pretty easy, okay? So, that the allele frequency proportion or percentage or frequency that these alleles show up, and then the last little statistic vocab piece that you need is this, genetic equilibrium. So, genetic equilibrium is, well, the consistent level at which alleles will frequency will be maintained over time, right? That genetic equilibrium should stay, constant unless there's some sort of outward force affecting it. Natural selection, right? So if something's going on in the environment, like competition for resources, that can skew genetic equilibrium, and then the allele frequencies change. Now, fortunately for you, you don't have to actually calculate allele frequencies of anything, but you do need to understand that the the number of times an allele shows up in a population, that creates the allele frequency. And if natural selection is going on, that can change the frequency or the amount of times that that allele shows up. And that is how that population will change over time. Okay, so a pattern of heredity called incomplete dominance governs flower color in snapdragons. We know that. We learned that in our genetics video. The population of snapdragons is in genetic equilibrium when the frequency of its alleles for flower color is the same in all of its generations. But what if somebody comes along and says, I don't really like the red snapdragons anymore, and they spray them with Roundup? Well, guess what that does? That affects your genetic equilibrium by eliminating all of the red flower genes in your population. Natural selection, okay? Allele frequency is changing, genetic equilibrium is changing, population is evolving, okay? Population that is in genetic equilibrium is not evolving. So if you're not in equilibrium, you are evolving. Any factor that affects the gene in the gene pool can change the allele frequency and then disrupt the population's genetic equilibrium. Roundup. There you go. All right. So one mechanism of genetic change is mutation, not Roundup. All right. So mutation can cause random changes in your DNA. And the idea is that those random changes can either make you more or less, successful in the environment that you're in. Okay? No way to control it, but that's one way that it can happen. Many mutations are actually lethal, but occasionally a mutation results in a useful variation that can then be passed on and affect genetic equilibrium in the gene pool. Another mechanism that disrupts a population's genetic equilibrium is genetic drift. This is the alteration of allele frequencies by blind dumb luck, random chance. Genetic drift can greatly affect small populations that include the descendants of a small number of individuals, but it really has zero impact when you have huge populations. The smaller the populations, the more narrow the gene pool is, the greater impact this genetic drift will have on its outcome. Okay? Genetic drift has been observed in some small human populations that become isolated due to reasons such as religious practices and belief systems. Genetic equilibrium is also disrupted by the movement of individuals into and out of a population, because if I leave the population, I'm taking my genes with me, right? And if I enter a new population, well, then I'm bringing my genes with me, and you just got to deal with what I bring, okay? The transport of genes by migrating individuals is called gene flow, okay? So if I'm going in and out, like I'm flowing, like my genes are flowing in and out of the population. When an individual leaves a population, the genes are lost from the gene pool. When they enter a new population, the genes are gained. All right. Now, natural selection is going to act on all these variations, and we're going to get a few different kinds of natural selection and like output from it that I want you to be familiar with. There's 3 different types of natural selection that you absolutely got to know. They're listed right for you here: stabilizing, directional, and disruptive selection. Remember, natural selection is acting on these phenotypes in a population, changing the allele frequency and disrupting genetic equilibrium. Now, stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection is natural selection that favors average individuals. So if you look close at this picture, a lot of people think this is all about the birds. Well, I suppose it's kind of about the birds, but look really close at the bottom, and you will see there's spiders in this picture. I hate spiders. Okay, so anyways, there's big spiders on one side, little spiders on the other, and then the medium-sized spiders in the middle. So what's this all about? Well, stabilizing selection is selection for the average size spider in this picture. If you're too big, then birds can easily see you, pick you off, and eat you. If you're too small, maybe you have a hard time finding food and catching it because you're a itty bitty spider that went up the water spout. That's a different story. Anyways, if you're medium sized, you're kind of right in the middle, not too big, not too small, and there you go, right? So there's favoritism for that average size individual. This is directional selection. So directional selection occurs when nature basically favors one extreme form of a trait versus another. So we got these woodpeckers here. Directional selection is going on when we think about the length of the woodpecker beak. So the idea here is that, I don't know, you got a population of woodpeckers. Some are born with like itty bitty noses, and then some are born with like gigantic schnozolas. Okay. So basically, the way this works is as everybody competes for like insects in the tree. If you've got a little bitty beak, you can only dig in just a little bitty far to get the bug. If you've got the big giant schnozola, then maybe you could like, plunge all the way into like the heartwood of that tree and like pull out every bug you could ever want to eat. So like there's favoritism for like the big giant long beak because you can reach farther into the bark and get more food than your little short beaked buddy who's going to starve, right? So that's directional selection. And then there's disruptive selection. Disruptive selection occurs when there's favoritism for both extremes and like the average is like selected against. So here we got little limpets that are living here on these rocks. You got to look close. They're there. Take my word for them. They kind of look like little sand dollars. Okay. So yeah, if you look at the rocks, on one end are very light in color. On the other end, they're very dark in color, which basically means the limpets need to match that color to avoid being eaten by that big white bird that's flying overhead. If you're dark on the dark rocks, you got good camouflage. If you're light, white colored or even kind of medium color on the dark rocks, the bird's going to eat you. The opposite is true on the white colored rocks. So like there's favoritism depending on where you are on the rocks to either be a white limpet or a very dark like brown or maybe even black colored limpet. But what you definitely don't want to be is somewhere in between because you won't blend in with anything and the bird will pick you off and eat you. So that's disruptive selection. So natural selection can significantly alter the genetic equilibrium of a population's gene pool over time. And those changes in the gene pool lead to evolution, potentially, of a new species over time. And I know that's kind of a hot topic. Like, how do you get a new species? Well, what we need to make sure we understand is what is the definition of a new species? Does the definition of a new species say that like a fish had to become a lizard and the lizard had to become a bird or something? That's not necessarily what it says. In order to form a new species, all you have to do is create a new population of organisms that refuses to interbreed with the original population. They could still both be birds, but if one bird just refuses to interbreed with the other bird, or genetically can no longer like interbreed with them and produce fertile offspring, they're considered separate species, right? So a species is defined as a group of organisms that looks alike, can interbreed, and produce fertile offspring. When you make a new species, we call that speciation. Couple different ways this can happen. First one's called geographic isolation. In geographic isolation, a physical barrier separates a population or basically divides it into two groups. Once divided, natural selection plays out ever so slightly differently in the two different geographic locations that can change the population over time, so much so that if you were to bring the individuals from those two separate populations back together, they might look at each other and go, I don't even recognize you, and want to have nothing to do with each other. All right. So that's speciation through geographic isolation. Here's an example with some frogs. So we got this population of green frogs living in the forest. Okay. So what happens if these green frogs living in the forest are separated by like a road or a river or something that cuts through there, and then maybe like humans come through and chop down all the trees? If you're on the side of the road that's still green, then you're a green frog. Hey, good on you, because now you got good camouflage and you're fine. But if y'all are on the other side where like all the trees have been cut down and you're green, you're in big trouble because it's brown over there, and you're going to stick out like a sore thumb. So only the frogs that are brown or maybe yellow are going to have good camouflage on the opposite side of the road, right? Or the river or whatever that is. All right. Now, over time, the populations will evolve or change in color and maybe even behavior, such to the point where they will refuse to interbreed with each other, even if you bring them back together. That is speciation. Okay. Here's another example, reproductive isolation. So in reproductive isolation, you don't even really need to separate these individuals into groups. You just need, for whatever reason, the genetics within these individuals to no longer be compatible. So in things like ferns, like they have multiple copies of their genetic material in every one of their cells, like up to 200 genes, which is crazy because they don't use them all at the same time. And what can happen is a fern, like fern A, could be using like the A batch of chromosomes, and fern B could be using the A batch of chromosomes. But for whatever reason, fern B decides, no, I want to use the B batch of chromosomes instead of the A batch of chromosomes. And the B batch of chromosomes is not compatible with the A batch of chromosomes anymore. So these two become reproductively isolated, and they don't and will not interbreed any longer. Okay? There are different types of reproductive isolation. One type occurs when genetic material of the populations becomes so different that fertilization cannot occur. Another is behavioral. So if we actually separate these individuals into two different groups and like natural selection plays out, and I don't know, like when they come back together, their behaviors are different. The timing of their mating cycles, I don't know, the mating dance that the male bird does no longer attracts the female bird. That's reproductive isolation too. Okay. So yeah, this is just different ways populations can change over time. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this polyploidy business because that's not going to be on your test. And finally finish with gradualism here. So speciation, it was once argued that evolution occurs at a slow, steady rate with small adaptive changes gradually accumulating over time. And that idea is gradualism. And there is some evidence from the fossil record that actually does support gradualism. But there's also some evidence of what we call punctuated equilibrium, which means that evolution can kind of happen in spurts. This was what was proposed in 1972 by Niles Eldridge and Stephen Jay Gould. This hypothesis argues that speciation occurs relatively quickly in rapid bursts with long periods of genetic equilibrium in between, right? And that is where we get all of the life that we see today. All right, ladies and gents, I don't want to drag this on any longer than I already have. This is the end of your notes on chapters 15 and 16 on how populations change over time, Charles Darwin, and natural selection. I hope you've learned loads. I'm Mr. Kennedy, and I will see you next time.